Picture this. Year 1774. You are in the lavish corridors of Versailles, where once glimmering mirrors showcased the splendor of absolute rule, when a far different reflection comes to light, one of rot, decadence, and the frailty of the human form. The man once adored as Louis the Well-Beloved would perish as Louis the Despised. His body was destroyed not only by disease but by the very toxins of his own monarchy. This is the tale of how the moral decay of a sovereign took shape in his disintegrating flesh, and how his rotting cadaver came to embody a kingdom already feasting on its own collapse. The era of Louis XV remains one of history's most stunning declines, a grim parable of unchecked authority and discarded duty. When smallpox finally took him in May 1774, it struck with such revolting force that even his most devoted attendants escaped the unbearable odor of his festering remains. But this monstrous end was simply the last scene in a tragic drama spanning decades, one that would help ignite one of the world's most cataclysmic revolutions. To grasp the full horror of Louis XV's downfall, we must begin by exploring how the brightest hope of the French crown became one of its most loathed monarchs. His tale does not start with the bloated king gasping for breath in a stinking deathbed, but with a child of 5 suddenly elevated to the throne of Europe's most powerful kingdom. The stark contrast between that innocent boy and the corrupted, diseased ruler he would become speaks to the total collapse, both moral and bodily, that defined his kingship. The year 1715 was both a conclusion and a new dawn for France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who had ruled for an unmatched 72 years, finally died, leaving behind an immense legacy of royal grandeur and financial ruin. His chosen successor, the 5-year-old great-grandson Louis XV, inherited more than the crown. He received the colossal hopes of a nation that had only ever known one monarch for nearly 3 generations. The young boy, soon to be king, had already lost both of his parents to illness, rendering him an orphan before he could even comprehend the crushing weight of royalty. In his minority, France was steered by a regency under Philippe d'Orléans, a time marked by relative freedom and economic stabilization after the Sun King's costly and endless wars. The young monarch received the most refined education that France could offer, studying languages, history, mathematics, and the military and diplomatic arts. His instructors noted his quick mind and believed he held real potential as a ruler. The royal court and the people of France regarded their youthful sovereign with genuine optimism, trusting that his rule might usher in a renewed golden era. When Louis XV assumed full royal authority in 1723, public affection for him was sincere. He was charming, clever, and seemed to embody fresh hope after the stifling final years of Louis XIV. The moniker, Louis the Well-Beloved, was not meant in jest. It reflected authentic admiration and expectation. Across the country, the people envisioned in their young king the dawn of reform, prosperity, and a more enlightened style of leadership than the increasingly rigid policies of the Sun King's closing reign. The initial phase of Louis XV's personal governance appeared to justify this hope. He wed Marie Laskinska, the daughter of the ousted King of Poland, in a union that reaffirmed France's dominant role in European affairs. Their marriage seemed rooted in real affection, and the Queen soon bore numerous heirs, securing the royal lineage. Louis XV also supported intellectual and scientific progress, encouraging philosophers and inventors, while keeping France at the cultural forefront of Europe. Yet even amid these encouraging early years, there were subtle signs of danger that went largely unnoticed. Louis XV began to show a concerning habit of hesitation, and he increasingly leaned on personal favorites and royal mistresses for matters of state. Unlike his predecessor, who had carefully crafted an image of sacred authority and strict self-control, Louis XV appeared more drawn to indulgence than the duties of governance. His court gradually earned a reputation for debauchery, one that would only deepen as the decades advanced. The shift from beloved sovereign to reviled monarch was not sudden. It unfolded through a long chain of blunders, scandals, and misjudgments that steadily eroded the trust and affection of the French people. Each successive crisis made more evident the king's incapacity to deliver the decisive leadership his country so urgently required. What began as a rule filled with hope and opportunity would over time spiral into a grim spectacle of military humiliation, financial catastrophe, and moral degradation, one that would eventually consume not only the monarch himself, but the very framework of the French monarchy. The slow-motion collapse of Louis XV's reign became a preview of the total implosion yet to come. The first significant challenge of Louis XV's rule came with the War of the Austrian Succession, which erupted in 1740 and stretched across 8 grueling years. France joined the conflict primarily to curb British influence and uphold its alliance with Prussia. However, the war swiftly exposed deep flaws that would haunt Louis XV's military endeavors for the rest of his reign. In contrast to the meticulously executed campaigns of Louis XIV, these battles appeared disorganized, lacking both clear goals and a unified strategy, a reflection of the king's own indecision and the increasing chaos within his administration. The cost of the war was astronomical, demanding heavy taxation and massive borrowing that drove France further into financial distress. The once feared French army endured demoralizing defeats and was forced to retreat from several crucial regions. More alarming was the king's direct participation in the conflict. On several occasions, Louis XV personally led troops on the battlefield, temporarily boosting his popularity. Yet his leadership fell short of what the crisis required. His wartime decisions were often swayed more by internal court politics and intimate alliances than by rational military planning. The war highlighted not only the limits of France's strength, but the dangerous gaps in its king's capacity to lead. During this era, Louis XV's marriage to Marie Leczinska began to unravel, as he grew increasingly entangled with a succession of mistresses. The most influential among them was Madame de Pompadour, who became not only his intimate companion, but also his closest political confidant. This unconventional arrangement shocked the royal court and the broader public, who viewed it as clear proof of the king's ethical decline and poor leadership choices. The growing role of mistresses in shaping state decisions became a persistent source of public outrage, severely weakening confidence in the monarchy's competence. The War of the Austrian Succession concluded in 1748, with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which restored most of the conquered lands to their original rulers, despite France's immense military and economic sacrifices. This outcome infuriated the population, who believed their sons had perished in vain, and their taxes had been wasted on a fruitless endeavor. It marked a crucial turning point in the nation's perception of Louis XV's. The once adored title well-beloved began to sound empty to an increasingly skeptical public. In response to the rising criticism, the king withdrew even further from public engagement, retreating into a tight circle of confidants who merely echoed his views. This detachment would come to define his later years on the throne. Louis XV became increasingly disconnected from the real concerns of his subjects, unable or unwilling to address their mounting frustrations. The divide between the extravagant opulence of Versailles and the daily struggles of common French citizens grew steadily wider throughout the 1750s. Worse than France's military failures was the expanding belief that the king cared more for his own pleasures than the nation's well-being. Rumors of lavish spending on his mistresses and favored courtiers spread across the country, often embellished, yet containing enough fact to provoke deep public anger. The construction of the Petit Trianon as a private sanctuary for Madame de Pompadour was widely interpreted as a clear sign of the king's skewed priorities, self-gratification over civic responsibility. The 7 Years' War, launched in 1756, would prove an even greater catastrophe than the conflict before it. This worldwide struggle saw France battling Britain and Prussia for dominance across Europe and its colonies. From the outset, French troops were consistently outmaneuvered and outclassed. The loss of nearly all French territories in North America, including Canada and Louisiana, became a source of national shame, one that haunted Louis XV for the rest of his life. The people of France watched in dismay as their global influence collapsed, while their monarch appeared more preoccupied with pleasure than patriotism. The unrelenting financial pressure of ongoing wars brought France to the verge of economic collapse. New taxes were introduced again and again, landing most heavily on the shoulders of the working classes, while the nobility and clergy preserved their age-old privileges and exemptions. This blatantly unfair taxation system became a major source of bitterness, aimed not only at the monarchy but also at the aristocratic elite. Louis XV's failure to enact effective financial reforms, due in part to opposition from powerful interest groups, and in part to his own lack of resolve, guaranteed that the nation's fiscal crisis would only deepen. By the close of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the metamorphosis of Louis XV from adored monarch to reviled figure was complete. The Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war, stripped France of the majority of its overseas empire and reduced it to a diminished global presence. Ting, once seen as a beacon of renewal, now embodied disgrace and imperial decline. Revolutionary discontent had begun to fester, though few could yet foresee how total the collapse of monarchy would be. In the aftermath of defeat, Louis XV withdrew even further into a life of self-indulgence. As national crises mounted, the king's daily life drifted more and more away from the business of governance. He spent his days hunting, entertaining mistresses, and attending ornate court functions that had grown increasingly hollow to a suffering populace. The chasm between regal extravagance and national distress became a central focus of the intensifying public criticism against Louis XV. The political sway held by royal mistresses reached its peak during this era, notably with Madame de Pompadour, and later, Madame de Barry. These women were not simply romantic companions, they played active roles in shaping decisions regarding war, diplomacy, and domestic affairs. This situation enraged the traditional aristocracy, who saw their own power diminishing, and it appalled ordinary citizens who took it as proof of the crown's moral rot and institutional decay. The image of crucial government offices being handed out based on sexual favoritism, rather than competence, eroded trust in the entire royal bureaucracy. Religious tensions further fueled Louis XV's plummeting popularity during these years. His decision to expel the Jesuits from France in 1764, though applauded by some factions, alienated devout Catholics who had long been loyal to the monarchy. Meanwhile, the king's personal behavior and the visible influence of his mistresses scandalized the faithful, who regarded such conduct as utterly unworthy of the eldest son of the church. This spiritual disillusionment was especially corrosive. It struck at the monarchy's deepest source of legitimacy. The economic troubles that had burdened France since the earliest years of Louis XV's rule deepened further during the 1760s. Despite repeated reform efforts by finance ministers, such as Étienne de Silhouette and Jean Moreau de Sechelles, the core structural problems remained unresolved. The tax system was still grossly unfair and inefficient. Public debt kept soaring, while growth was stifled by outdated privileges and rigid economic controls. The king's seeming indifference to these urgent matters further undermined his standing among the rising bourgeoisie and reform-minded nobility, who increasingly saw economic modernization as vital for France's survival. Civil unrest became more frequent in this era, fueled by widespread food shortages and worsening poverty. Riots and uprisings erupted throughout the country. The crown's response was typically repressive, relying on military crackdowns rather than tackling root causes. These harsh measures only heightened public anger toward the monarchy and reinforced the belief that Louis XV was hopelessly detached from his subjects' misery. The king, once hailed as a paternal figure, was now increasingly regarded as a tyrant. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment posed a growing ideological threat to royal power. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau began to challenge the core beliefs of divine right and absolute monarchy that had long upheld France's royal regime. Although Enlightenment philosophy was first confined to intellectual circles and educated elites, its influence gradually expanded to reach wider layers of French society. The personal behavior and political shortcomings of Louis XV offered textbook examples of the very abuses Enlightenment writers condemned: inefficiency, decadence, and despotism within an unchecked monarchy. For critics like Voltaire and Rousseau, the king's reign became a symbol of everything that was wrong with hereditary rule and divine authority. The growing discontent among the public found validation in the writings of these philosophers, who advocated for rational governance, individual liberty, and limits on monarchical power. Ironically, Louis XV's efforts to silence dissent only amplified it. His regime attempted to contain the spread of subversive literature through censorship, book bans, and legal persecution, but these heavy-handed tactics backfired. Instead of stifling dangerous ideas, they sparked curiosity and gave them a forbidden allure. Underground networks circulated banned texts, and what was once whispered among philosophers soon became common conversation among merchants, artisans, and even peasants. Rather than preserving royal dignity, these oppressive measures highlighted the king's fear and fragility. By trying to smother critique, Louis XV only confirmed the accusations of tyranny that thinkers of the age were already leveling against him. The infamous trial of Robert François Damiens, who attempted to stab Louis XV in 1757, exposed the depth of public resentment toward the king. Although the attack was universally condemned, the fact that the wound was superficial and Damiens cited political motives suggested that even attempted regicide could evoke some level of understanding among the population. France's international disgrace did not end with warfare. The monarchy's failure to stop the partitioning of Poland, despite deep historical alliances, further diminished France's diplomatic standing. The king's foreign policy appeared passive, responding to crises rather than shaping them, reinforcing perceptions of incompetence and weakening France's influence in Europe. By the end of the 1760s, the chasm between ruler and ruled had become critical. Louis XV governed a people who no longer trusted his leadership or his concern for their well-being. The economic, social, and political tensions that would later explode in revolution were already festering, yet the king seemed indifferent or paralyzed. The 1770s opened with France still drowning in debt accumulated under Louis's reign. Each new finance minister promised solutions but failed to implement change. Their reforms were often blocked by aristocratic resistance, and Louis's support proved unreliable. With each failed attempt, the monarchy's impotence became more obvious. Social unrest intensified. Crop failures led to food shortages and riots in major cities. The poor bore the brunt of oppressive taxation, while nobles and clergy kept their privileges. This glaring injustice, paired with constant reports of court extravagance, many exaggerated, yet plausible, fueled growing rage. The contrast between the starving masses and the indulgent aristocracy became impossible to ignore. Scandal further tainted Louis's personal life. His affair with Madame du Barry, a former courtesan of humble background, shocked nobles and commoners alike. Unlike previous mistresses, du Barry made little effort to uphold courtly decorum. Her presence at Versailles came to symbolize the moral collapse of the monarchy. Religious tensions also escalated. The king's suppression of religious orders and his own behavior alienated devout Catholics. His clash with the Parliament of Paris over these matters created a constitutional crisis. When he exiled the magistrates and replaced them with loyal courts, it only heightened concerns over royal authoritarianism, without resolving the deeper unrest. Meanwhile, Enlightenment thought flourished. Books challenging absolutism and advocating alternative forms of governance found eager readers. Louis's failures seem to illustrate exactly what Voltaire, Rousseau and others had warned about: the dangers of unchecked decadent monarchs. Censorship only made these works more sought after. France's prestige continued to erode. The monarchy failed to act decisively during major diplomatic crises. Foreign policy seemed driven by court intrigue, rather than national interest. France's influence shrank, its allies drifted, and its enemies mocked the once formidable power. As the early 1770s progressed, Louis's health began to falter. Though he kept up his usual schedule, hunting, ceremonies, routine court appearances, he seemed increasingly frail and weary. Some attributed this to years of criticism, scandal and failure, finally taking their toll. By the time his illness struck in April 1774, few expected it to be fatal. While staying at the Petit Trianon with Madame du Barry, the king began to feel unwell, complaining of headaches, fatigue and fever. Doctors initially dismissed it as exhaustion, but his condition declined rapidly. On April 28, the unmistakable signs of smallpox appeared, painful pustules forming across his body. In the 18th century, smallpox was a feared killer, having already claimed members of royal families throughout Europe. The moment the diagnosis was confirmed, panic swept through Versailles. Those who could fled immediately. The disease was known to be highly contagious, and often lethal. Though the royal physicians, Dr. Bordeaux and Dr. Lassin, were among the best of their era, medicine had no real tools against smallpox. They attempted bleeding, purging, and poultices, all ineffective and likely harmful. As the pustules spread, Louis's body swelled grotesquely. Once known for his charm and good looks, he became unrecognizable. The sores cracked and oozed a putrid discharge that made the air in his chambers unbearable. Servants who had loyally served the monarchy for decades refused to enter. Even his doctors could hardly stand the stench. The palace that once stood as a symbol of splendor became a house of rot. Yet the physical horror paled in comparison to the psychological devastation. Louis, obsessed throughout his life with dignity and image, had to watch himself decay. The mirrors in his room were removed at his command. He could not bear the reflection of his ruined face. Etiquette at court, once rigid and sacred, collapsed. As the king's suffering grew undeniable, ceremony was abandoned. Courtiers fled. Even daily service to the monarch faltered. Terrified staff either deserted or became ill themselves. Versailles, a kingdom within a kingdom, dissolved into chaos. Madame du Barry, ever present by Louis's side, was abruptly exiled on orders from the royal family. Her presence was deemed both disgraceful and dangerous. The woman who had once ruled the king's heart was cast aside in fear and shame. In the final days, only a few remained, servants too loyal or too bound by duty to leave. The king drifted between fevered delusion and moments of clarity. During the rare lucid periods, he expressed remorse. He asked God's forgiveness. Some accounts even claim he sought pardon from the French people. But these whispers of repentance were overshadowed by his appalling physical state. His groans echoed down once golden halls. The suffering he endured, mental, emotional, and corporeal, was staggering. The very body politic of France seemed to decompose with its king. By May 10, 1774, Louis XV was dead, His death brought both relief and revulsion to the few individuals still present at his bedside. The king's final breaths were marked by violent spasms and visible pain, with observers recalling how his body convulsed before finally falling still. The man who had once been the living embodiment of divine royal power died in circumstances more humiliating than those reserved for common criminals. In the immediate aftermath, the complete collapse of public affection for the monarchy became glaringly apparent. Rather than the grand mourning customs traditionally expected after a king's death, a strange mood of release, almost celebration, swept across France. The streets of Paris reportedly erupted in joy at the news. Churches, which should have tolled solemn bells of grief, remained silent. The sovereign, once hailed as Louis the Well-Beloved, had perished without love or lamentation from his people. The condition of Louis XV's remains presented immediate logistical and symbolic issues. The ravages of smallpox had so thoroughly disfigured his corpse that standard mortuary procedures could not be carried out. The odor from his chamber was so overpowering that even seasoned embalmers could only approach the body in brief shifts. The embalming was done hurriedly, with many traditional rites set aside because of the body's foul condition. A swift decision was made to encase Louis's decaying corpse in a lead-lined coffin and transport it to Saint-Denis without delay. This break from custom, no lying in state, no majestic funeral processions, was publicly justified as a matter of public hygiene. Yet many saw it as a deliberate attempt to avoid dwelling on the king's disgraceful death and the decay his reign had come to represent. Even the funeral procession itself was a pale imitation of past royal honors. Few members of the aristocracy were willing to participate, and bystanders along the route watched not in sorrow but in fascination, more like witnesses to a grotesque spectacle than mourners. The coffin remained sealed, preventing the traditional final viewing. The rush and secrecy surrounding the burial gave the entire event an air of shame rather than ceremony. Contemporaries described it less as a king's funeral than a sanitary disposal. The decay of the corpse seemed to reflect the rot at the heart of the monarchy itself. Even in death, Louis XV's remains continued to be a source of discomfort and disgrace for the monarchy. The lead-lined coffin could not contain the overwhelming odor of decay, and the funeral service at Saint-Denis turned into a physical ordeal. Several attendees reportedly fell ill, whether from infection or simply the unbearable stench. The bishop officiating was forced to truncate the usual rites, further stripping the event of its ceremonial dignity. To many observers, the king's putrefying body symbolized more than just physical death. It was the outward manifestation of the moral and political rot that had taken hold of the French monarchy. The contrast between Louis XIV's opulent, carefully choreographed funeral and the rushed, shame-filled burial of his successor could not have been more jarring. Pamphlets and satirical songs quickly appeared, mocking the decay of royal authority by comparing the two monarchs, one a sun-king, the other a rotting shadow. The ascension of Louis XVI was immediately overshadowed by the grotesque circumstances of his grandfather's end. At just 20 years old, with no experience in governance, he inherited not only the crown but the colossal burden of a bankrupt state and a disillusioned population. The memory of his predecessor's painful, humiliating death was a chilling reminder of just how mortal royal power could be. Internationally, reactions were mixed. Official condolences were sent from European courts, but behind closed doors, many foreign leaders viewed the king's passing as a welcome development. France's loss of an indecisive monarch was seen as an opportunity to reset diplomatic relationships. Meanwhile, gossip and speculation about the king's final days circulated freely, further damaging France's prestige abroad. What had once been the most dazzling example of absolute monarchy was now becoming a cautionary tale. The death of Louis XV marked far more than the end of an individual ruler. It signaled the final collapse of the divine aura that had surrounded the French crown for generations. No longer untouchable or elevated, the king had died the same way as thousands of others, helpless, diseased, abandoned. His body, wrecked by smallpox, had become a grotesque equalizer, no different from the corpses of peasants he had never met, and with his demise, the myth of the monarchy's immortality died too. Perhaps the most damaging legacy Louis XV left behind was not just his physical demise, but the enormous financial disaster he handed to his successor. The national debt had reached a crisis point. Drastic measures were urgently needed to prevent total institutional collapse. Yet the same rigid political structures and entrenched social privileges that had blocked reform during Louis XV's reign remained fully intact, ensuring that Louis XVI would face the same immovable barriers. The monarchy's inability to solve France's growing economic distress would become one of the main triggers of the coming revolution. The inequalities that had bred resentment under Louis XV, an unjust tax system, unchecked aristocratic privilege, and a widening gap between rich and poor, were never properly addressed. Though Louis XVI seemed earnest in his desire for reform, goodwill alone could not overcome the bitterness left behind by decades of neglect. The personal hatred once directed at Louis XV now shifted seamlessly onto the very institution of monarchy itself. With little improvement seen under the new king, public anger no longer distinguished between sovereigns. The throne had become the focus of popular frustration. Abroad, the ripple effects of Louis XV's mismanagement also lingered. The monarchy had lost vast colonial holdings, its diplomatic standing had withered, and its perceived weakness continued to affect France's ability to rival powers like Britain and Austria. Even Louis XV's support of the American Revolution, a move meant to restore France's image, only served to further bankrupt the state without delivering meaningful diplomatic advantage. The downward spiral that had begun under Louis XV could not be halted. The Enlightenment ideas that spread during his reign had firmly taken root. Educated French citizens increasingly saw monarchy not just as flawed, but as inherently unjust. Changing kings was no longer seen as sufficient. The loss of moral legitimacy could not be reversed with the mere passing of a crown. The structural failures that emerged under Louis XV, bureaucratic paralysis, tax inefficiency, and resistance to change, remained under his grandson. Every attempt at reform was sabotaged by the same forces that had thwarted progress before. The very governmental machinery that had once enabled France's greatness had become an obstacle to its survival. And behind all of it, the image of a rotting king in a sealed coffin lingered like a curse. The reign of Louis XV stands as one of the most dramatic collapses in political history, a devastating demonstration of how personal weakness and institutional failure can together destroy even the most seemingly unshakable systems of power. His transformation from adored child king to reviled monarch reveals the fragile nature of legitimacy and how quickly it can erode when power is exercised without responsibility. More than anything, Louis XV's rule illustrates what happens when power resists reform. The same absolutism that had once made France mighty became the very thing that destroyed it. By the time reform was truly attempted, the system had already lost the trust of the governed. The monarchy was not just outdated, it was irredeemable. His final moments, filled with rot and abandonment, were not merely the death of a man, but of an idea. The king who died alone, shunned and unmourned, would become the face of everything that had gone wrong with the old order. He did not ignite the revolution, but he made it inevitable.